There are husbands who know how to say goodbye without saying a word. They are the ones who walk the land a little longer than they need to in the last weeks of autumn, who count the provisions twice, who draw maps with careful and unhurried hands and fold them small enough to fit inside a single palm. Elias Holt was that kind of man, and his widow Clara was about to learn what that kind of love looks like when the snow comes early and there is nowhere left to turn. If you believe that love can outlast the man who felt it, subscribe to Countryside Tales and ring the notification bell. This is her story. Elias Holt died in the first week of October, before the leaves were fully down from the balsam trees on the ridge, of a fever that came on fast and did not leave. He had been a sound man all his life, broad across the shoulders and steady on his feet. The kind of man who could read weather in the color of the morning sky and the thickness of bark on the locust trees in late summer, and who had not seemed sick until he was. And then he was gone in 11 days. Clara Holt was 31 years old when she buried him on the ridge behind the cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Carolina, with their boy Tommy standing beside her in the cold, holding her hand without speaking, the way Elias himself would have stood. Tommy was 8, and he had his father's gray eyes and his father's quiet, and lungs that rattled like loose tin when the cold got into them, which it did now more often than not in the high country. The doctor in the valley said mountain winters were no place for a boy with lungs like that, and had said so more than once, and Clara had thanked the doctor and stayed anyway, because the ridge was her home, and Tommy's home, and the only place she knew how to be. In those first weeks after Elias died, the people in the settlement below came by with firewood and covered dishes and their condolences, and then, as the weeks wore on, they stopped coming. The Garrett family, whose property ran along the lower part of the ridge road, made it known more than once that a woman alone with a sick boy and a half-stocked woodpile was not going to fare well through a hard winter. "You should move down to the valley while you still can, Mrs." Garrett had told Clara on 2 different Sundays in November, in the voice that some people use when they have already decided what they think and are waiting for you to agree with them. Clara thanked her and said she was fine. She was not entirely fine, but she was not going to say otherwise. She had the map. In the last hours, when Elias was still able to lift his hand and hold a thought long enough to speak it, he had pressed a folded piece of paper into her palm and told her to keep it safe, and told her it showed a way through the ridge to a hollow place in the cliff face that he had found 2 summers before, and told her she would know when she needed it. She had not understood what he meant. She put the map in the cedar box under the bed, and had not taken it out again until the night the blizzard came. The storm rolled down from the north on the 1st of December, faster and harder than any snow Clara had seen in her 10 years on the ridge, and by midnight the cabin roof was groaning under the weight of it, and by 2 in the morning a section of the roof gave way entirely and let in a column of frozen air that no fire was going to answer. She wrapped Tommy in everything she could find and rebuilt the fire twice, and by 3 in the morning she understood they could not stay. 2 evenings before, she had walked down the ridge road through the first flurry and knocked on the Garrett door to ask if they might lend a bedroll for Tommy in case the cold got bad. Mrs. Garrett opened the door to a narrow crack of yellow light and looked at Clara standing in the snow and said, "We've got our own to worry about. You should have listened when folks told you to move down to the valley," and closed the door. Clara had stood there in the dark for a moment with the snow coming down on her shoulders, and then she had walked home and asked God to forgive her for what she was feeling in that moment, because she was trying to raise a good boy and she did not want bitterness to become a habit. She reached under the bed. She took out the cedar box. She took out the map. She lit the lantern. "Mama," said Tommy from underneath 3 quilts, "are we going somewhere?" "Yes," she said. "Put on your coat." The path on Elias's map went northeast. up the ridge past the big balsam tree he had marked with an X, then through a long stretch of dense mountain laurel so thick and low that a person could barely walk through it in good weather and had to go through it on their knees in a storm. And Clara did exactly that, with Tommy on her back in the dark. He was 80 pounds of boy and too old, in ordinary circumstances, to be carried. But his lungs were not good enough for that kind of uphill breathing in a blizzard. And so she wrapped his father's mother's hand-stitched quilt around both of them and tied it across her chest with a length of rope from the shed, and went out into the storm with the lantern held ahead of them. The quilt was old, made from patches of Elias's childhood shirts, the blue calico from his school years, the brown wool from his first winter coat, the yellow cotton from his mother's apron, and Clara had slept under it for 9 years and knew every patch by memory. She kept her head down through the laurel slick, pressing one hand ahead through the iced branches and keeping the other pressed against Tommy's legs to hold him steady. And Tommy did not speak, because he understood, she thought, that speaking would cost them both something they could not spare. What she did not yet know was that there was more inside that hollow cliff than shelter. She found the cliff face after another 20 minutes of walking, when the lantern caught the darkness behind an overhang of rock and showed her an opening wide enough to walk through sideways, and she stood before it for a moment, in the howling dark, with the snow driving against her back, just breathing. And then she went in. The inside was narrow for the first 10 feet, and then opened into a chamber about the size of a small room, with a stone ceiling tall enough to stand beneath, and the wind did not reach it, and that alone nearly brought her to her knees. She set Tommy down against the far wall, and raised the lantern, and saw the woodpile first. 8 good pieces of split oak stacked along the left wall, and wrapped carefully in oilcloth against the damp, and next to it a bundle of tinder and a cloth sack dry as a July noon, and next to that a tin box with a tight-fitting lid. Elias had been here, in this hollow in the cliff that the cold could not reach, and he had left her something no storm was going to take away. She got the fire going on the 4th try, because her hands were shaking too hard to manage it on the first 3, and when the tinder caught, and the oak caught, and the chamber filled with warmth that felt like something she had almost forgotten was possible, Tommy stopped shivering within 15 minutes. "Papa made this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Clara. "He did." The blizzard lasted 4 days, and each of those days had a shape that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, with a precision that surprised her. The way extreme things sometimes burn themselves clear into the memory. On the first morning, she opened the tin box and took inventory. A small cloth bag of dried chamomile and comfrey, tied with a note in Elias's handwriting that read for Tommy's chest. A tin of cornmeal measured out in 5 days' portions. A piece of salt pork wrapped in waxed paper. A tin of lard. 4 candles. 2 boxes of matches. A folding knife, and a coil of rope, good for 20 feet. She set each item on a flat rock near the fire and counted it twice, the way Elias would have counted it, and then she made the chamomile tea and told Tommy his father had measured it out for him specifically, and Tommy drank every drop without complaint. Each morning after that followed the same careful order. She woke before Tommy and rebuilt the fire from the banked coals of the night before, measured the cornmeal and made a thin hot porridge over the flames, boiled the water for the chamomile tea, and then, while the water heated, she unfolded the map and studied it by firelight. She was beginning to see it differently than she had at first. It was not only a path to the cave, but a picture of the full lay of the land surrounding them, drawn in Elias's careful pencil lines. A spring marked a 1/4 mile to the east, where the notation runs, all winter. Deep source. A stand of mature timber on the northern slope. The ridgeline traced all the way to the county road below. The hand-stitched quilt stayed around Tommy's shoulders through all 4 days like a second skin, and by the second morning his lungs had eased, and he was asking questions about everything, running his fingers over the cave walls and wanting to know how deep it went. And on the third morning he was sitting up and asking to see the map. She spread it on the flat rock between them and let him trace the pencil lines with his finger, and he found the spring first and asked if they could go there, and she said when the snow cleared. On the third day, she found a second note tucked beneath the tin of lard, in Elias's handwriting, on a small piece of paper folded twice. "The fire draws well," it read. "I tested it in September. Smoke goes up through a crack in the back wall, and you won't even cough. I thought of everything I could think of. I hope it was enough." She held that paper for a long time without setting it down, and when Tommy asked what it said, she told him it said his father had thought of everything, and Tommy looked around the cave at the fire, and the food, and the rope, and the dry wood, and said, "Did he?" And Clara said, "Near enough." She had not yet opened the letter. The tin box held one more thing, a piece of paper folded several times and sealed with a drop of candle wax, and she had been aware of it since the first morning, but she had not opened it, and she was not entirely sure why, except that it felt like opening it would close something, and she was not ready for it to be closed. She thought about the 2 years Elias had spent coming up to this cliff face with provisions on his back, one trip at a time, without telling her a word of it, and she understood that what he had done was a kind of faith. Faith that she would be here, that she would survive long enough to need what he had made for her. She let the letter sit in the box through the second day and the third. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind dropped, and the light through the cave entrance changed from dark gray to pale silver, and Tommy went to the opening and looked out at the mountain, and came back with snow in his hair and a look of pure relief on his 8-year-old face, and said it was clearing. Clara looked at the tin box. She looked at the letter inside it, folded and sealed and waiting. Inside that tin box, behind the candles and the folding knife, there was a letter that was going to change everything. She opened it. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides in Elias's careful hand, and Clara read it through twice before she said a word. He had written it in early September, 2 weeks before the fever came, when he did not yet know what was coming, and he had written it because he had been thinking about the winter, and about the years after, and about all the winters after those. He wrote that if she was reading it inside the cave then, she had made it there, and he was glad. He told her about the spring to the east, and how it ran all year because it came from deep in the mountain where the cold could not reach it, and he described the timber on the northern slope, and the value it held for the right buyer. And he described the 4 boundary markers he had set himself at the corners of the property, so she could find them when the snow melted. And then he told her what he had done. 2 years before he died, Elias had walked the 43 miles to the county seat on a Tuesday in March, carrying a written description of the land and a witness statement. And he had filed a formal claim on the eastern ridge section, the cave, the spring, the timber stand, and the full 43 acres of high ground above the hollow. And he had done it quietly, without telling anyone except the one person he needed to tell, because he had wanted it done right and not argued about before it was finished. The claim was registered in Clara's name. He wrote out the claim number and the name of the clerk who had processed it, and he wrote, "You won't have to leave. The timber is worth real money to the right buyer, and the spring is worth more than the timber. There is enough there to keep you and Tommy for a long time if you are careful about it, which I know you will be." Clara set the letter on the flat rock. She sat for a long time watching the fire, and then she put her face in her hands and wept. Not entirely from grief, though grief was in it, but from something that was harder to name than grief, something closer to the feeling of being held. The fullness of what she was holding. the particular size of the man she had lost. Tommy came and sat beside her without saying anything, and she pulled him against her with one arm and held him until she was done. When the snow had settled enough to walk, she and Tommy came back down through the Laurel Slick and down the ridge road to the settlement, where old Mr. Beaumont, the blacksmith who had known Elias for 30 years, had organized a search party and was partway up the ridge when he saw them coming through the bare trees. He let out a sound that was not quite a shout and came toward them through the snow. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Lord be thanked. Where in the world were you all this time?" "On the ridge," said Clara. "In a place my husband made." Mr. Beaumont looked at her for a moment with the look of a man who understood, from the steadiness in a person's face, when not to ask too many questions. "He was a careful man," he said. "Yes," said Clara. "He was." She showed him the letter that evening, and he read the claim number and the clerk's name and nodded slowly. "I was the witness," he said. "He brought me down to the county seat himself and asked me not to say anything to anyone until it was needed. I gave him my word." He looked at the letter in her hands. "You're going to need that in the spring." In April, when the snow was pulling back from the ridge in long gray sheets, and the spring to the east was running clean and bright the way Elias had said it would, a man named Tillett arrived at Clara's cabin with a representative from a land company in the valley, and a document that he said gave them rights to the eastern ridge section, including the cave and the spring and the timber stand. He was a careful, quiet man who did not raise his voice, which made him harder to deal with than a loud one, and he told Clara the claim she held was improperly registered, that the clerk in question had made errors in several other filings that year, and that the company had obtained the rights through a corrected process. "I'm not looking to put you out," he said, standing in the doorway of the cabin that the settlement neighbors had helped her re-roof in February. "I'm only here to let you know the situation." "The situation," said Clara, "is that this is my land." She set Elias's letter on the table beside the written confirmation she had already received from the county seat, and Tillett read both of them with the careful attention of a man who had expected to find less than he was finding. Mr. Beaumont stood in the corner with his hat in his hands and said, in the quiet and deliberate voice of a man who has lived 70 years and is particular about what he puts his name on, "I witnessed that filing myself. I was in that office. I will testify to that in any county court you wish to name." He looked at Tillett directly. "You are welcome to try. Some men prepare for storms. Others only wait for them to pass. Elias Holt was not the waiting kind." Tillett looked at the letters on the table and at Mr. Beaumont in the corner and at Clara, who was standing with her hands at her sides and her eyes level and calm, not performing anything, simply present in the way of someone who knows what she has and is not going to be talked out of it. He folded his document and put it in his coat pocket. "Good day, Mrs. Holt," he said. And he and his man walked out and down the ridge road without looking back. Mrs. Garrett was in the yard when Clara came to the door. She had come up behind them and had been standing in the yard through the whole of it, and Clara did not know for how long. But she looked at her without any particular feeling one way or the other and said, "Thank you for coming," and meant it plainly. And Mrs. Garrett opened her mouth and closed it and nodded once and walked back down the road. By June the cabin was solid and the timber rights were negotiated, and Tommy's lungs were stronger than they had been in 2 years, and Clara had planted a kitchen garden at the spring's edge where the ground stayed soft, and the water ran clear all day. The map hung on the wall above the fireplace, framed in a piece of window glass that Mr. Beaumont had cut for her, with a letter framed beside it, and the firelight touched both of them in the evenings while she and Tommy ate their supper at the table Elias had built. One evening in June, Mr. Beaumont came up the ridge road for supper and sat across the table from Clara and looked at the framed map on the wall for a long time before he spoke. He knew. He said finally. He knew exactly what he was doing, every step of it, and he did it without once asking anyone to tell him he was right to do it. "That was Elias," said Clara. The old man nodded and looked at his hands on the table. "He was right to trust you with it," he said. Clara looked at the map in the firelight and the letter beside it, and at Tommy, bent over his schoolwork at the other end of the table, and at the quilt folded over the back of the chair, the blue calico and the brown wool and the yellow cotton, all of it still holding together. And she thought that the greatest thing a person could do for someone they loved was to prepare for the worst without saying a word about it, to lay it all down ahead of them like a path through the dark. Sometimes inside someone who looks defeated, there is a person who is only waiting for the right map. Clara Holt did not survive that winter alone. She was carried through it by a love that had been laid down carefully, quietly, piece by piece, in a hollow in the cliff that the cold could not reach. And she kept going, because that is what the people who love us best ask of us when they can no longer walk beside us. They ask us to keep going. Have you ever held on to something someone you loved left behind, not knowing that one day it would save you? If this story reached something inside you, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to Countryside Tales so you never miss a story. Ring the notification bell. And share this with someone who needs to hear that the love of a good person doesn't end when they do. Until next time. With all our hearts, the neighbors who knew Clara Holt in those mountain years all told it the same way every time, how she came down out of that December blizzard with her boy on her back and a map in her coat and a look in her eye, like someone who had been somewhere very warm.